Are you lactose intolerant or do you just have some indigestion from dairy? This is what I want to talk about today because this is one of the things that we find is the most often eliminated food groups for people who come to Com Clinic, certainly among others. But dairy seems to be something that people eliminate very quickly due to having a food sensitivity or an intolerance or something to that effect. So I wanted to talk about it a little bit because the dairy group in particular is really important nutritionally, and so if there's any way that we can include it in some way, shape, or form, or find appropriate alternatives, we definitely want to do that. The dairy group in particular certainly is great for helping the body get enough calcium and vitamin D for the day. Also contains phosphorus, which is really important for cellular function in the body, and it's really high in protein. So there are a lot of great benefits to dairy, and of course, above all, they help us meet our calorie goals and help us give us energy through the day. So we want to figure out for people who are really struggling to digest dairy, what might be going on there, whether it's really an intolerance or whether it might just be some dairy indigestion that we could potentially work around in the future. Dairy intolerance is definitely really common, especially in our culture. Essentially what a dairy intolerance is the body is having a difficulty with creating enough of the enzyme that's required to digest the lactose sugar that's in the dairy. And so without enough of that enzyme, that sugar is not getting appropriately digested, and it can lead to a lot of just upset stomach, bowel inconsistency, cramping, etc. So that's really what is happening with dairy intolerance. There are definitely ways to test appropriately for dairy intolerance. They usually will do it right through your doctor's office. So generally there's a breath test that you can utilize, or sometimes they'll do a blood test. Those are both really pretty reliable evidence on whether or not you may have a lactose intolerance. A lot of people are taking food sensitivity tests or mail-away tests that help identify whether someone might be sensitive to a food or might consider needing to eliminate a particular food or food group. And I would shy away from using these tests as a definitive answer as to whether or not you're dairy intolerant. A lot of these tests are really just testing for a type of protein that occurs after you eat a food, but the reality is that it's very normal in the human body to produce these particular types of proteins after you eat a food. So oftentimes when you're taking an intolerance test or a food sensitivity test, they're just detecting the proteins in your body from the food that you had just recently ate. So very often it seems that if we take one of these allergy tests or insensitivity tests, we see, oh my gosh, all these foods that I'm really already eating are causing me some kind of insensitivity and I need to eliminate them. When in actuality, it's really just a normal function of the human body. And if there's anything on any of those tests that you have questions about, I definitely recommend kind of doing follow-up testing at your primary care to just make sure that that's something that medically we should treat or really take note of and try to work around. For people who do have lactose intolerance that's been confirmed by testing, it's not necessarily an indicator that you have to eliminate all dairy from the diet. Sometimes tolerance of different types of dairy or dairy foods can change from person to person who's dealing with lactose intolerance. So it might be worthwhile to try to see if there might be some foods that you might still be able to tolerate. For example, low lactose cheeses, typically cheeses that have been aged a very long time that are potentially low lactose. And there are also lactase enzymes. So if you take them at the time of a meal, you can take those enzymes and ideally be able to trust or digest that food a little bit better than you otherwise would. So even if you're lactose intolerant, there are definitely ways to kind of work around it and still incorporate some dairy in moderation into your diet. Another thing that you can consider if you're lactose intolerant is finding appropriate staples or alternatives. So this, I think, is something that is really tricky in our food culture because a lot of the dairy alternatives that are out there, they really don't necessarily replace what we get from the dairy group itself, essentially the calories, the protein, and appropriate vitamins and minerals. So I think if you're looking for things like oat milk or soy milk or almond milk or things of that nature, I would just check in with the ingredient label. Ideally, from a dairy alternative, we would love to see 7 or 8 grams of protein per serving. That's typically what you'd get from dairy. So if you're not getting it from a milk alternative, it just means that you're going to need to find ways to make it up elsewhere in the diet to make sure that you're meeting your nutritional needs. But that's another good place to go. So aside from lactose intolerance, if someone either hasn't been tested or has taken this insulin or this allergy or food sensitivity test and is not sure whether they are really truly allergic or intolerant to dairy, but they're getting a lot of these symptoms, we want to do a little bit more investigation into what types of dairy they're consuming, in what amounts, and things of that nature, because dairy is really one of the things that can cause a lot of indigestion in the body. And so essentially, if we kind of understand digestion a little bit, what we have to know is that dairy in particular, and really all foods, they require a specific amount of enzymes and biles and other digestive juices that have to be present for the food to be appropriately broken down and absorbed. If those elements aren't present or they're not there in high enough quantities, what happens is just exactly what we think of when we think of digestive upset, right? Gas, bloating, cramping, bowel inconsistency, and things of that nature. So with dairy in particular, we not only need the lactose enzyme to be present and to be present in enough amounts, but a lot of dairy also either comes with fats, or there's a fat element to a lot of dairy, or it may be in the presence of a sugar. So that would be something like ice cream, where if we potentially eat it in high amounts, we're getting high amounts of dairy, but then we're also getting high amounts of sugar. So if we're eating different types of dairy foods in kind of excessive amounts, what's going to happen is all of that comes into the digestive system, and at some point, the body can kind of only produce so much bile or digestive enzymes at once, and the system saturates. And so the body has essentially produced as much as it can to help you digest the food that's present, but then the rest kind of doesn't really get appropriately digested, and that's where all those symptoms can occur. So this is where it may not be a lactose intolerance or a lactose sensitivity. It might literally be indigestion, and that, I think, more than just eliminating the dairy, we have to figure out how to incorporate it more appropriately in the diet so that it sits a little better in the system. And so part of that is understanding maybe portion sizes of typical dairy products and noticing which types of dairy are triggers for you. So typical recommendations for dairy, depending on the person, are 3 to 4 servings per day. A serving of something like a milk or yogurt or a cottage cheese is typically a 1 cup or 8 ounce portion. And then in terms of cheeses, it's usually 1 or 1.5 ounces. So that could be like a shredded 4 sliced cheeses. It's usually on the package. It might be 1 or 2 slices would equal a serving size. And an 1.5 ounce serving is about what will fit in your palm. Sometimes I say the claw into the cheese bag. That's generally a good marker for about 1.5 ounces. And so thinking to the times where you're experiencing this lactose sensitivity, could it be potentially that you were just having more than 1 serving in a sitting? And if that's the case, all we want to do is monitor that. And maybe for particular foods, pizza is a huge one. So for some people, they get really, they think they're lactose intolerant because of eating a high amount of pizza. Really, it's probably just indigestion. And we might just need to moderate the amount of pizza we have at the meal and incorporate other elements. So potentially like side salads or other appetizers or anything else that would go towards making that meal more complete without it being all pizza. Other places that we hear this would be something like a high pasta with a creamy dish. And that necessarily isn't lactose intolerance either. Typically cream sauces like Alfredos, or anything with a lot of sour cream or cheddar cheese on it, thinking kind of Mexican food, all of those have very high fat content. There are a lot of dairy products that actually are considered fats. So sour cream being one, cream cheese, and then we've got like mascarpone and creme fraiche and things like that. Those are generally, the serving sizes are 1 or 2 tablespoons. And the reason is because the fat quantity of that product is quite high. So it's really just meant to kind of top and flavor a dish as opposed to really make up a full component of the dish. So when we eat that type of food in high amounts, again, because of the fat content, the body may not be able to make enough bile and enzymes to digest it, and it really doesn't feel great. So All of that to say, we see a lot of people eliminating dairy in their diets, and because of that, they're reducing their protein intake, they're reducing their calorie intake overall, and they may not be getting the micronutrients that they need to function optimally throughout the day. So our recommendation is to really, if you think you're lactose intolerant, go to your doctor and follow up with testing. If you've done kind of a mail away food sensitivity test, find lactose alternatives if you are able to, and find things that ideally kind of replace the nutrient components that you would get from dairy. And then if you really think this is maybe more about indigestion, it's more about monitoring the serving sizes and how much you're having at one sitting to help you with digesting that a little bit better rather than eliminating that group entirely. So I hope this helps understand a little bit more about lactose and how it's related to digestion. Stay tuned, and see you in the next one.